Thank you very much for this kind invitation. I'm very pleased to speak among such distinguished guests and distinguished delegates, and I'm pretty embarrassed by your question. I'll try to answer as frankly as I can. I'm very worried. The worsening of the relationship between the European Union and Russia has never been so serious. So to answer your question, I have to say that we were better off in the past, in that there used to be strong tensions that led to the most dramatic and the most wrong war, but there was a dialogue that considered the role to be played by Russia in the economic and political relationships of ours. Well, there's more of a sense of fatigue prevailing today, and I hope that the meeting that took place yesterday between Frau Merkel and Russian President Poroshenko and the French President, well, as I was saying, I hope that yesterday steps forward were made to improve the situation, but as of last, the situation hasn't been good. Now, going back to the past, I recall that in 2002, 2003, the European Commission launched on an important cooperation with Russia with 4 spaces: economy, security, justice, and science and education as joined together. So way back, there was a strong proposal for cooperation that was not only at economic level, but was thoroughly global and comprehensive, involving also an aspect that is not marginal, as certain politicians believe, i.e. culture and research. Well, the basic idea, or the assumption, was that between Russia and Europe, a strong relationship had to be built, so much so that we would refer to the relationship with vodka and caviar as representing, the strong convergence of our interests. Well, nowadays, the predicament is certainly completely different. In the past, we developed the economy and market situation for 2002 that was very important also to Russia to have access to the WTO. So we were building, we weren't even just talking, we weren't just paying lip service to the building, we were actually and practically building things together. I remember quite clearly that also in formal occasions we would also refer to free trade area as that would be the natural outlet, the natural result of the relationship we were building between Europe, the Urals, and the area beyond the Urals, where the worsening of the situation is now certainly most alarming. The situation is really as a trough in international environment, international and cultural circles. There are politologists that look at the Cold War with some nostalgia, just to mark the negative predicament we are going through at the present time. Well, accidents that take place on an ongoing basis, but I believe that certainly that doesn't amount to the Cold War, to the tragic division that we experienced in the past. Verbal tensions make us think about those years, the years of the Cold War, and to be frank, I feel certainly not nostalgic when referring to the Cold War. Certainly, Ukraine plays an important role. Mutual and symmetrical mistakes transformed a bridge into a battlefield. And that is certainly an historical mistake, as this led to a confrontation and opposition between the US and Russia that is certainly widely spread at the moment, so much so that an agreement in Syria for the Middle East has been made much more difficult. Again, to be very frank, I have to say that without an agreement between the US and Russia, we won't get to peace in Syria. We won't get to a truce in the Middle East. Certainly that the agreement might not be enough because the situation is so complex in the Middle East. But again, it is a necessary condition, though not being sufficient. Without that agreement, no step forward can be made. As I said, again, the agreement between US and Russia is all necessary, and that in a way points also to the weakness in Europe, in that we should have a dialogue between Europe and Russia to tackle the problems in the Middle East and Ukraine. But again, the weakening of Europe is detrimental to the building of peace and cooperation in the future. The weakening of Europe, again, over the past few years, through sanctions, through the breaking up of the daily relationship we had, led, as was said earlier on, to a worsening also of our vested interests. Trade declined. Export of the European Union to Eurasia between 2013 and 2016 dropped from 150 billion worth of 84 billion of dollars, with a reduction by some $70 billion. And this is thoroughly incredible. This is certainly not justifiable. This is quite a collapse, which has important repercussions on us, because certainly Eurasia is the fourth trade partner of the European Union after US, China, and Switzerland. And as a matter of fact, Eurasia would be the third partner for the European Union. The atmosphere has been negatively affected because sanctions certainly have repercussions only on our trade with Russia. But if you go and look into details and look at the Eurasiatic Association countries, well, it is quite obvious that the trade dropped from 118 to 74 billion with Russia. In Belarus, from 9 to 5.8. So again, the reduction is very similar. From Kazakhstan, 8.6 to 6.8. In Armenia, from 1.1 to 760 million. In Kyrgyzstan, from 700 to 400 million. So it is pretty widespread and comprehensive, this breakup of the relationship. Basically shifted from a political situation to an economic collapse. And the same is true also for trade from the Eurasiatic countries to Europe. But I would like to point out to the fact that all our exports are dropping: chemicals, food, industries. So this is not a partial reduction in trade. It is, again, pretty much a comprehensive and widespread. And this has to do not just with trade, but with investments, with negative repercussions on investments as well. The European Union certainly dropped importantly from 62 billion in terms of investment, dropped to negative values because in a way we received profits of previous investments without any new investment being made. And that obviously caused an important, very relevant mutual damage. And that there are certain companies that in a way, dropped out completely. So the main problem is that of a political tension with Russia. But, as I was saying, the consequences are wide-ranging and involve the whole Eurasian continent and worsen our relationship with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Belarus. Political and economic relationships are obviously intertwined. This is a truism, of course, that this cannot be discussed. This is unquestionable. Facts, data show quite clearly that easing political tensions would bring about an economic improvement, and the opposite is as true. But as a matter of fact, there's no dialogue underway at present between the European Union and Eurasia. There's no economic dialogue. There's no political dialogue either. Now, to react again to the question that was raised by the chairperson, Mr. Cassieri, the political community gave different reactions. We started dialogue in the past, and that in the post-war period, after the war in Iraq, led to caused some difficulties, but there was also rapprochement. More recently, we remember the proposal voiced by President Putin in 2011 when he proposed the setting up of a harmonious community, as he said, between the Atlantic and the Urals. Afterwards, tensions increased. The bilateral summits were done away with and cancelled. The liberalization visa was basically blocked, and that was actually something that would go to the benefit of both parties. And negotiation for the partnership agreement was discontinued, and then sanctions were raised. I already commented on that. So there has been a progressive worsening of the situation at a systematic level or systemic level. Then there are always the ongoing problems between NATO and Russia. I remember a bilateral summit in Paris where a constructive relationship had been just started. Then tensions again increased. And I remember that we had quite a discussion at the Bucharest NATO summit when President Bush proposed admission of Georgia and Ukraine to NATO. France, Germany, and Italy voted against, so that the process was stopped. So there was an articulated reaction from different countries. And I remember that being the last action on the part of the government that I chaired over when I was Prime Minister, because I had been voted against. But I remember that France and Germany had actually an agreement and were persuaded on not wanting any breakup in the relationship. But now, after many provocations, there has been some military drills, so much so that it seems like the military are playing a more important role than politicians, and this certainly is, again, weird. There are things that I frankly do not understand, as for example, I don't understand how the Nord Stream was entered into at a time when sanctions were raised. I find it sincerely quite difficult to understand how Germany, in a way, is leading the pro-sanction side and leading also the investments in the same area. I had tabled an informal proposal that informally had been accepted by the Germans, by the Russians, by the Italians, i.e. using the oil ducts in Ukraine with a company that would be held by Ukrainians and Europeans and Russians, so that Ukraine would receive certain guarantees as to the supply and there are resources that are necessary to a country, but the worsening again of the situation made it thoroughly impossible to accept proposals that seemed to be acceptable. Anyway, this is not something that is the objective of this meeting. This is just but the situation at the margin. But I believe that we can do something. We can work towards economic cooperation, which, as I said, certainly cannot but promote and enhance also the political dialogue. God knows when that is going to be resumed. Anyway, I firmly believe that an economic dialogue can certainly be resumed despite the difficult conditions we're going through at present. This is certainly in the interest of Russia. I myself am an economist by profession, and I see that the progress that Russia has started cannot be promoted, and if not with strong ties with Europe, and Europe in terms of energy cannot consider itself safe without relationship with Russia. So again, Europe has certainly a great interest in building new bridges, and the same is true for Russia. Russia certainly has an interest also in keeping a certain balanced situation between East and West. Rosneft shifted its attention or its focus eastward, and this is obviously quite understandable because Russia in itself is a bridge toward east. But looking at the future options, looking at the diversification in economic terms, I believe that the ties between Russia and Europe are all important and indispensable. So the present ties certainly weakens Europe and weakens Russia and weakens all the other Eurasian countries. Correcting this is an uphill task. This cannot be done easily and fast, but this should be started. I for myself believe that politically speaking would be possible to have an opportunity for Eurasia and the European Commission to talk, to see whether there's the possibility to start a cooperation that are all necessary. I believe that we could start, for example, with an initiative that I would name as reasonable. For example, a conference with the delegates from the European Commission and Eurasiatic countries, just but an exploratory conference to take stock of the situation, to look at the repercussions in economic terms about the poor state of the relationship between Europe and Russia, with tangible proposals being made to make progress. We could name it, for example, initial conference, investigative conference. So anyway, a conference to try and take stock of the situation, speculate on the situation, as we're doing here now. Very friendly, in an open way, in a very informal way, even. Well, I believe that this should be, this is an opportunity that should be considered by the European Commission and by all the Eurasian countries. Indeed, I refer to Eurasia, not just Russia, because this obviously gives a new importance to this proposal that I'm just voicing. I for sure believe that the Kazakhstan, holding the presidency of the Eurasian continent, certainly approves of this proposal for establishing a dialogue. I believe that we have to, we must, we should come up with a proposal to open up dialogue again. Dialogue being obviously the very soft term. Realistically, I'm not obviously referring to free trade treaty or any of the treaties that have been named in the past, because, you know, there's a new phase in history that we've entered into. A treaty had already been signed between the US and 10 countries of the Pacific area. Well, that treaty can certainly not be ratified. The Atlantic Treaty between the US and the European Union is at a standstill. Just think that a treaty with Canada has been blocked as well because of the opposition by Wallonia, i.e. one of the parliament of the European countries, and that obviously doesn't make dialogue any easier. But again, I understand that the free trade agreement is not to be mentioned at the moment because of the present predicament. But anyway, the resumption of dialogue, the resumption of previous ties is absolutely realistic and feasible, despite the predicament we're in today. Just think. The president of the US, whose mandate is about to end, is for these major treaties, whereas the two candidates are against. Both of them. A major change is underway. There's a major change also when it comes to the public in the US perceiving the negative repercussions of globalization, despite the many advantages that it brought about. So much so that the politics is changed dramatically. So much so that there's always somebody who can veto something. So I believe we should correct the mistakes we've made in the past. We should try to mend the situation and start a dialogue on individual issues so as to pave the way to a future improvement of the relationship. I believe that there's the tangible possibility for specific negotiations that might be approved of by all the parties involved, and that may also improve the national economy, in that this is the first time in modern history, contemporary history, apart from the very short time at the beginning of the economic crisis, where the international trade is growing less than the economic development worldwide. It is always international trade that promoted development, and it is only in the recent past that this hasn't happened. Well, as I was saying, I believe that there are tangible possibilities for a negotiation rebuilding the cooperation that was in place in the past so as to obtain the acceptance of all the parties involved. I believe it is high time we rediscovered how useful compromise and negotiation could be. Compromise seems like a not so nice a word, but when you're in such difficult situation, compromise can be a good word, can guide our actions. Thank you.
Grazie al Presidente Prodi.
Thank you to President Prodi, and I would like to say that we still have some available minutes, and I'd like to ask a question, because his own comments and remarks are not only lectures and lessons, but rather projections that allow us to have a vision, which is so rare, especially in such a situation in Italy. I do not think that Professor Prodi wanted to call the attention on what is happening and going on in the political conscience of the United States in such a rough moment of the political campaign. And we know that this is a sort of a strategic orientation, especially as far as intentions and willingness to bring to positive conclusions, the treaties that have been voted and accepted, and on the other side, trying to understand whether and to what extent the new presidency, whatever it may be, it will be accepting to discuss that extreme Eastern pivot Asian vocation that was the sort of the hinge of the American politics, that is recentering the attention of the United States on that part of the world which is considered to be the winning one for the next 20 years, for the next 2 decades. By just trying to make use of interference, between quotation marks, interference tools between the USA and Eurasia. So using as a trump card Europe and Russia as a joker card in order to allow for such a good contrasting action versus the Chinese power. So what I'm wondering, what do we have to lose in doing that? Nothing. In pondering upon things, we never lose anything. We never lose any chances, nor opportunities. My first answer to your question is that I don't really hold in great considerations the declarations made during presidential campaigns. I'm much too down to earth in order to do that. But let me say that your question is very, very appropriate. Because in the declarations, especially if we consider the 8-year term of Obama, there was always an obsession, China versus Asia. And problems always came out from the European Spring, the relations with Russia, Middle East. There is sort of a schizophrenia in between the long-term projections and the current reality, the one we are absorbed in. And I believe that that was a true problem, because projecting the problem, especially of the relations between the United States and China, and let's make it clear ever since now that that's going to be a very strong and tough obstacle to overcome in history. Well, doing that was making us neglect and disregard what the day-by-day situation in the political arena is important, especially in order to prepare future scenarios. And we will know that the rest will come by itself. I've been working for some 6 years in China. I've been studying China, and I think that there is a very interesting aspect, Freudian aspects of the love-hatred nourished by Americans and Chinese respectively. There is this schizoid activity as far as feelings, deep feelings run, and creating the incredible enemy. But all of my sons, nonetheless, Chinese sons, nonetheless, are going to be sent to study to the USA. So there is this incredible ambiguity. But in the political arena, and I've seen that my time is up, yes, we do have to take and bear in mind long-term balances, but we have to handle with great accuracy today's problems. the United States haven't done that till now. And our European leaders haven't done that either. Now, today, I wasn't making any daydreaming discourses nor statements. I think that we should try and make concrete projections and experimentations so as to bring about an atmosphere that could open up the dialogue in between us. I believe that those who have direct political responsibilities have to do both things. They have to take into account and bear in mind both issues, both problems. I'd like to confine myself to saying what could probably be a good proposal, a good suggestion, helping us to find solutions in the short term, but also in the long term. Thank you. Thank you, President Prodi.